Do you want me to give you a bit of an introduction, and we'll start it off then?
By all means.
We've got 41 people in the room, which is lovely to see. So welcome everyone. This is a series of webinars that we're doing to coincide with Disability Week, and it's across Bradford and District, but we've got people wider nationally that are interacting with this, which is lovely. We've had a series of webinars this week to really get together, share good practice, discuss subjects, and take learning back to different organisations, different parts of the country. So I just want to introduce Natalie Baker, who has been doing a project within Airedale around reasonable adjustment and inclusion, and identifies as someone with dyslexia who has had lived experience of knowing what it's like to need reasonable adjustment in place. And she's going to take us through the project that she's done and some of the resources that she's developed in supporting people from a neurodiversity background. I'll just tell you a little bit about the webinar. So Natalie will take us through a few slides. You'll have an opportunity to interact, ask questions and have a discussion. The webinar is being auto-recorded and will be downloaded on the Bradford and Craven partnership site where you did the booking from. So if you want to re-look at it or look at the slides, they'll be available from that website in future. And you can see last year's festival as well. It's building force on last year's festival, so that'd be lovely to have those resources at your fingertips. So the second part of the recording, webinar, I'll stop the recording because sometimes it can feel like people want to personally disclose some things that maybe they don't want to share wider than within this group. So I'll stop the recording at that point so people feel safe that they can raise issues and discuss things freely. So I'll hand over to Natalie, who's going to start us off. So welcome, Natalie.
Thank you. Hopefully, please will someone interrupt me if my slides don't show. I'll tell you when I've moved on and let me know if it doesn't move on. I can't see any of you, which may be a better thing for me that I can't see 41 of you, but Freya's going to keep an eye on everything for me. So just pop any questions in the box. So as Freya said, I've sort of come on to talk a little bit about reasonable adjustments, but it does go off slightly on a tangent from there. So I'm hoping as my slide moved on, Freya.
It has, yeah.
Perfect,
yeah.
Lovely. So lovely introduction from Freya, but I thought it'd just be worth sort of giving a little bit of background as to who I am and why I sort of have anything to talk about on this topic. So my name is Natalie. I work at Airedale as a hand therapist, and over the last 12 months, like Freya said, I've been doing a secondment 1 day a week, looking at improving equality, diversity and inclusion within AHPs at Airedale Trust. I am dyslexic, so I come under the neurodiverse bracket, which is kind of where my passion and focus for the project went, under the bigger umbrella of equality, diversity and inclusion. So just in case there's anyone on here that isn't aware, neurodiversity is a word used to explain the unique way people's brains works. While everyone's brain develops similarly, no two brains function alike, and being neurodivergent means having a brain that works differently from the average or neurotypical person. On this sort of first slide, I've popped this little quote up on here. It was something that kind of resonated with me during the project, because I very much felt that I sort of was being given that voice and been sort of having some belonging for that to be heard. And hopefully what will come across during this project is that I'm sort of I feel like I'm in a very privileged position, that dyslexia doesn't really define who I am as a person. I haven't really let it stop me. And in fact, if anything, it kind of spurs me on to sort of go out for different things. But I know that's not the case for many neurodivergent individuals. And sort of the NHS and the systems the NHS have were quite behind compared to the rest of industry for supporting individuals with neurodiversities. So one of my main focuses for my project was to start by building culture change. One big driver was to sort of create a compassionate and inclusive cultures within our organisation and systems, because delivering high quality care depends on sort of creating that positive, inclusive working environment where people want to come to work. So trying to sort of shift that culture was one of my big sort of goals for the project. So first steps in terms of doing that was to try and empower people at work, and to do that we need to sort of improve disclosure, because we kind of can't expect to support people if we don't know what's within the trust, and what support might need to be there. I was very keen for Airedale to kind of front load the conversation around disclosure, and that being all the way from the application process through the interview, through job acceptance letters, corporate and local inductions, and followed through on a yearly basis through PDRs and wellbeing conversations. If you've been to any of the other talks this week, you'll perhaps have been to the ones around recruitment at Airedale, and you'll have seen some of kind of these steps that have been put into place and that others were working on prior to my project, to look at improving those kind of steps. So there was a research done in Airedale as part of our Enable Staff Network group, and that looked at disclosure and reasons for disclosure, and why people don't disclose. So out of the individuals that responded to the questionnaire, 69% said they hadn't disclosed their disability status. And of those, 66% didn't know how and 20% didn't want to. And the majority of the reasons for that 20% not wanting to disclose were very varied, but predominantly surrounded around fear of discrimination if they did disclose, and that information then being used against them in terms of if they went for a promotional interview, that they wouldn't be given that job role because it would be known that they had a disability. So we do obviously need to also, on the sort of counter argument, respect that individuals do have the right not to disclose, and for some people that's they would rather that was the situation. But it was important very much that we kind of got the message out there that disclosing on ESR is confidential, and it's not something that your line manager or what have you would find out, and the importance of that information for the trust to look at where they need to offer support and where they need to sort of put the funding. So I felt very much that we need to kind of create a non-judgmental environment where individuals feel safe to disclose, and therefore be able to access the services that are available to make their working environment more equitable. So on our main home screen page on ESR now, we have this little icon with the please review your equality and diversity information. So this originally had been sort of put out as a bit of a pilot, but had not really taken into account anything sort of to do with neurodiversity. So the writing was red and it was on a yellow background, which wasn't overly helpful. So we kind of changed that and adapted it to being a little bit more inclusive on this pastel background, in the hope that individuals will sort of feel like they could disclose. The other thing that we put into place was a guide around the ESR and disclosure, and subsequently my project developed from there around things in regards to educating managers, asking regular wellbeing checks whether individuals need any support, sort of promoting the positives and advantages of neurodiversity, and then sort of the sharing of resources and showing what adaptations can be put into place. So one of the sort of main issues with our current processes is that at school and university you are fully supported, you are provided with a lot of equipment to make things more equitable. You're given extra time for exams and given sort of tools to enable you to succeed to your potential. However, you enter the workplace and that's all just forgotten. Apparently you're supposed to just not have dyslexia anymore when you enter the workplace. That's gone. You don't need any support. You just sort of have to function along. As many of you may know, in June this year, the NHS released an EDI improvement plan setting out standards that trusts should meet, and kind of support Airedale's reasonable adjustments offer. The sort of main focus of my project was to develop management level training with a practical based learning guide to support neurodiverse staff, along with case study based learning examples around reasonable adjustments. Airedales have received this really well, and the training is currently in the process of being made into essential trust training at Airedale. And the kind of reason sort of around this is that we can't just assume that people in management positions sort of are equipped to support reasonable adjustments without offering them support and education, and allowing that sort of neurodiverse voice to be heard, and not just stereotypical assumptions being made as to what individuals may need or may not benefit from in terms of adaptations in the sort of workplace. So there's a paper guide that goes alongside the sort of online training, and there's a version for staff who may have a neurodiversity, and tips on how to make sort of their working environment a little bit more conducive to themselves. So the sort of purpose of the neurodiverse management level training was to increase understanding and reduce the stereotyping of neurodiversity, equip managers with the skills to support staff so that they kind of don't just get a blank face if you, if you've managed to pluck up the courage to disclose to your line manager and then you just are sort of fronted with someone that doesn't have any answers. It can sort of put off that process and trying to break down those barriers. It's to increase understanding around reasonable adjustments, the Enable Me passport and the process that I need to make adjustments, provide practical tips for both managers and colleagues to ensure a conducive working environment. And then it was really important that case study examples from our trust were used, so that there was sort of real world examples as to how things have been put into place within the trust. So the document that was made is an adaptation of the NHS Health England Guide to Practical Based Learning for Neurodiverse Students, designed by Laura Farr, which again, some of you may have seen. This kind of struck me as a really great document, but I didn't really understand why it was just for students and why that wouldn't be something that would be continued into employees and when you become an employee at a trust. So the document itself goes through definitions, terminology, and talks about spiky profiles, which I'll come on to in a minute. It talks about diagnosis and highlights the importance that it's not essential to have a formal diagnosis to be able to get reasonable adjustments within the workplace. It takes each condition individually and gives an overview. It talks about potential characteristics of each neurodiversity, but it importantly highlights the unique qualities that each neurodiversity can bring to the workplace. And that was really important to make sure that we highlight what individuals bring, rather than just seeing what perhaps adjustments need to be made and not seeing those as a negative. Within the document, there's a formatting guide to make things in terms of presentations, emails, or resources sent out to all colleagues, more neurodiverse friendly. And finally, rather than having a specific guide for each individual condition, such as a guide for individuals with ADHD, it takes common characteristics of neurodiverse individuals, because we know that it's all a little bit of a spectrum, and those who perhaps have a formal diagnosis of dyslexia may also have characteristics of ADHD or autism, and it's important that we don't just continue to sort of stereotype what individual characteristics a condition come with, and rather deal with what the individual themselves finds a challenge. So I kind of pulled this example out, and it highlights the version for the management level and then the version for the individual themselves, and gives those practical tips of how perhaps you might overcome something that you're having an issue with. So for instance, the example on the screen is the sensory processing. So for the individual, it's to give ideas as using break times to go to a more calming environment, so go for a walk or sit in the car. And then it's reflected in the management one that they could perhaps bring that as a suggestion and offer opportunities to walk away from overwhelming situations. So it's sort of building a picture for an individual rather than a condition themselves. So a minute ago I mentioned about spiky profiles. So a spiky profile is a sort of really good way of explaining the difference between neurodiverse and neurotypical skill set. The reason the guide was designed, as previously mentioned, was due to the spiky profiles. So you may have heard about them. And as you can see on the graph on the screen, the grey line represents a neurotypical set of skills, and the yellow line highlights the more spiky presentation of a neurodiverse individual. So there are things that rather than just kind of being average at everything, there are things that individuals excel at, and there are also things that may need support in order to make the working environment a little bit easier. So it's kind of important that we shift the narrative from reasonable adjustments are just people being awkward, that they're just allowing for people to do less work, or the impact that these adjustments may have on already strained services, and actually look at it in a whole sort of different way. So there's quite a lot of research out there, none of it to do with the NHS. As I kind of said at the beginning of the presentation, we're a little bit behind compared to the rest of the industry, as with many things. But we know businesses are actually actively seeking out neurodivergent staff to join their workforces. And many of the reasons are sort of shown on the screen. So neurodivergent individuals tend to be 28% more engaged at work. They have sort of a more they tend to stay in companies longer, so 3 times longer. And obviously we have retention issues in the NHS, so if we can support our neurodivergent staff, they're more likely to stay within the trust itself. Neurodivergent workforces. There was a study by Hewlett Packard who showed that teams are 30% more productive. Individuals with autism were shown to be 90 to 140% more productive than their neurotypical employees. And it showed that companies with inclusive cultures are 6 times more likely to be innovative and agile, which is kind of what we're looking for within the NHS. So if we just go back to the spiky profile again, those aspects that neurodivergent individuals often excel in are actually the core values, behaviours and beliefs that the NHS seeks out. What reasonable adjustments are there for is to support in the areas in which the neurotypical environment does not work for neurodivergence. And by doing this, we're able to get the best and tap into the unique perspectives and often out of the box thinking and problem solving skills that we need in the current climate, and take away the stresses that surround work for many neurodivergent individuals. So I thought it would be helpful to just kind of see beyond the NHS what things are kind of happening out there in the real world. So this is a screenshot taken from a fashion website. You'll see in the first picture it's highlighted the yellow circle around the little person. There's many websites now, most of which in the fashion industry at present, that have this icon. If you click on this icon, it opens up these 2 options. So you can ask for bigger text, you can subdue the colours, you can stop images moving to reduce over stimulation, and you can also change the font to a dyslexic friendly font. So the second picture with the arrows pointing at it are just highlighting the more subdued background of the pictures, and also the dyslexic friendly font at the bottom. And these are all sort of things that really we need to work towards in the NHS to be able to adapt sort of the online systems to people's preferences, and that can be neurotypicals as well. It's not necessarily just an adjustment that benefits neurodiverse individuals. So what steps did we take? The initial step was to look at our adjustment passport. So as a trust, we had this document called the Adjustment Passport. Now, before starting my secondment, I worked at Airedale for 5 years. I'd never seen, never heard, and never filled this out. So I went to fill it out, and as hopefully you can see looking at this document, it probably couldn't be any more unfriendly to neurodiverse individuals. There's a lot of words, too many words. There's a confidential stamp in the background written over other letters, and it just really isn't a conducive document. So my further issue with the passport itself was its name. So the adjustment passport to me had very negative connotations and made it sound like I was being difficult and that I couldn't do my job, and I needed adjustments being made. So the passport has been reformed and renamed to the Enable Me passport, to essentially enable me to do my job to the best of my abilities without being disadvantaged. The passport is now a simple document encompassing colleagues as a whole and supersedes filling out or multiple documents which you may have in your own sort of trusts. So if you happen to be a menopausal carer with ADHD, you don't have to fill out 3 different forms. You can just fill out one form to enable you to do your job better. And we need to start making the environment fit the individual, not the other way round. So this is now what the new passport looks like. It is an editable PDF, which is much more conducive to filling out than a Word document. So you can only fill out the boxes that you actually need to fill out and write in. There's reduced information on the document itself, but it has an accompanying guide should you need more detail as to what to put in each section. And it puts the person at the driving seat of their work and working situation. This is obviously something that we've worked on as a trust ourselves, but if you're unsure or if your department doesn't have one, NHS England do actually have something called the Health Passport, which does look more so at disability than encompassing sort of carer responsibilities or any other sort of personal characteristics, but it is again an editable PDF online, and you can just go and download it. So it's quite a good resource if you don't have one as a trust, and if it's something that you feel like you could do with some formal document to write down sort of what your needs are, then this is quite a good option to go for. So reasonable adjustments. I think it's important to say that there doesn't need to be a formal process with employee health and wellbeing to enable putting reasonable adjustments in place. If they can be agreed at a local level within a department, then that's great. That's as far as it needs to go. And I think that's one of the big messages that needs to be changed. I think everyone sees reasonable adjustments as this really formal process that need a lot of individuals involved just to make a simple adjustment, such as extra admin time or a quiet space to write notes. So we have developed a reasonable adjustment toolkit flowchart to kind of break down and support individuals to make the process a lot more accessible as to how to go through the process itself. So the initial stage of the flowchart is sort of staff can access this if they're just at the start of the process and just wondering where they go. So obviously you can see here that the staff members' sort of responsibility is to complete the Enable Me passport and then take that up to their sort of line management level, and then it helps guide a line manager through the process to be able to support an individual. It takes you on through the steps, and it talks about when the adjustments are agreed and recorded on the passport, what do we need to do at that process, at that point in the process. And it talks through at what stage you would need to get it sort of escalated and taken to employee health and wellbeing, or whether it's something that can just be sorted at a local level. And I think it also gives permission to managers to be able to make that decision themselves. At the bottom of the flow chart, there is a to Z of workplace adjustment ideas. So these are just simple things that people maybe haven't thought of themselves. And I think it's really important, again, to kind of acknowledge that one size doesn't fit all. You may have 2 dyslexic individuals within the department whose needs are very different and very varied. So having some understanding of ideas of things that might help, I think particularly for individuals that get diagnosed later, so perhaps get diagnosed as an adult, you often have a lot of coping strategies at that point, but you're not aware that that's what it is because you didn't know why you did it. And sometimes having sort of some suggestions of adjustments can just help clarify that actually that is perhaps something that you are making an adjustment for and could be better supported by the trust itself. I wanted to also just talk a little bit about things that I found along my way doing the project itself. So we know one of the major sort of characteristics of dyslexia is difficulty with reading. I've popped 3 examples up here because these are 3 examples taken off Google of how it may feel to read as a dyslexic. And I think it's really interesting to see how varied these are. So these are all supposedly examples. And if we're sending reams of information, we're asking individuals to read research papers or protocols, this isn't, fonts aren't always that helpful, and there are more beneficial fonts to use. So one that we have come across is something called Open Dyslexic, which you will have noted is the font that I have used throughout this presentation. So Open Dyslexic is a font that is weighted heavily at the bottom of each word to make a defined, clear line so that the brain can't make sort of puzzles and pictures and merge everything. Often with dyslexic individuals, D's and P's get flipped over. So these are slightly twisted so that the brain again can't flip them, and this is something that's been quite transformational for myself to have come across, because I can now read documents without falling asleep, which is fantastic, and it's really sort of transformed. If I'd had this at university, it would have been really helpful. So there are 2 ways to download this. There's an American website who charge a monthly subscription, and there's also a British company who is a charity, and you can just donate as much as you can, and then you can download the files. There's also something called bionic reading, which is where the first 2 to 3 letters of each word is in bold, and this is supposed to help individuals with ADHD be able to read faster and make that process easier. So there's lots of things out there. It's just that our systems aren't always sort of beneficial to that, but there's lots of adjustments that you can make yourself for individuals in the department or yourself in terms of downloading the text and changing it on your emails so that you receive emails in dyslexic friendly font, and also a lot of colleagues now send me information in this text so that I can read it and access it a lot easier than previously. I just kind of wanted to finish with this slide. This is something that a few of us have put into place at Airedale, and it's just a little note at the bottom of my email signature. So it's just the purple writing at the bottom, and it says, "My apologies if there are any spelling, grammar mistakes or confusion with my email. I have dyslexia. Please understand I do my best to reduce these errors. And if you have any questions, please do call me and I'm happy to explain my email further. And I think this is really sort of powerful, and it's not sort of putting that excuse within there, but it's explaining to individuals that may not have come across before why there might not be any grammar in your email or why there may be spelling mistakes, rather than it just being deemed that you've sent a sloppy email and not taken your time to write it. It's also really empowering for individuals within your trust that may not feel confident to speak out to anybody about the fact, and seeing other people and people in higher positions openly disclose, I think again sort of does that 360 back to where I started with this talk, in terms of offering up that sort of culture change, that this normalizing the fact that you can disclose without discrimination and there's no sort of repercussions, and especially those in sort of more management superior position holders, because then that filters down, and it can be quite inspirational for individuals. So I feel like that was a very whistle-stop tour. I do tend to talk very fast. But thank you very much for listening. And if there are any sort of questions or comments, then I'm happy to sort of help with those.
Lovely, thank you, Natalie. That's been really good, and lots of information in the chat box. You'll have a chance to have a look at it now. It's been going wild, really, the chat box, around some comments and questions around that. So I'll just stop the recording now. I've picked up a